today we're going to discuss informed consent forms, okay? A little bit of what we're going to cover, it's the same type of things, right? Consent, informed consent, consent in research, who are your audience, how does a trial, a protocol, and a consent tie in together? We're going to talk about some of the regulations. We're going to go through the informed consent process. We're going to talk about how consents and protocols all fit in to the clinical trial. We're going to talk about who your audience is in the case of a clinical study. We're going to talk about some of the regulations, elements of required elements of informed consent, the do's and don'ts of writing an informed consent form, and then we're going to talk about recruitment and how to make sure that you have the best path forward for signing subjects up for a study, okay? Let's start off by talking about consent. So consent is actually larger than like research and the medical system, right, as a whole. So basically consent is when a person agrees to give permission to do something, right? So when you're dealing with consent, it's about communicating the activity and then a person gets to decide to participate or not. It's a legal and it's a moral protection from unauthorized, right, invasions on our property, on our bodies, etc. So let's think of an example here, right? Someone gets in your car and drives off with it. What is that called? Theft, right? Someone asks you, hey, can I borrow your car for the afternoon? What is that called? I borrowed a car, right? You go to the doctor's office and they need some blood. Someone just shows up with a needle and stabs you and collects blood. That's an invasion on your body, right? You're made aware that you have to get a blood draw. You're told why you need to get a blood draw. You sign off on it. You're aware of the process and they walk you through it. That's you're consenting to have blood drawn, right? So you're basically, consent changes an action that is not permitted to an action that is permitted, right? And consent in research is different than consent in a medical setting. Mine is doing this funny thing now too. Sorry guys, give me 1 second. Consent changes an activity that's not permitted to an activity that is permitted, right? But consent is for, you know, everyday things, is different than informed consent. Informed consent has both legal, ethical, and regulatory requirements, right? And the informed piece is what I want you guys to focus on. It's really about making sure that the person who's consenting or planning to consent has a full understanding of the scope of activities that are going to occur. And that is not always easy to do, especially when you're dealing with medical research, right? Mm-hmm. You could be dealing with just a general member of the population. Mm-hmm. If you bring them in and you say, I have this device and I have lasers in it and LEDs in it, and we're going to do calculations in the back end, and then there's software, that could be really confusing. I mean, even the clinical terminology itself can be confusing, right? So you really need to keep the end user in mind. So informed consent in research is one of the key founding principles of the ethics of research, right? And it's based on the Belmont Report's idea that there is respect for persons, and a person has the right to decide. Something's going on. Can I just share from my computer?
You would have to log into this.
It's frozen. A person has the right to decide whether they're okay to partake in something or not, right? And the goal is the goal of research is very different than the goal of clinical care, right? In clinical care, when you go to the doctor, there's a purpose to you going to the doctor, right? You're going to benefit in some way. They're going to make you feel better about something. You have a rash, they're going to give you medication, you're going to feel better, etc. The goal of research is very different. The goal is to produce general knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. And the general knowledge may not even benefit the person who's participating in the study. It's actually to benefit other people, right? So that in that way, we are dealing with something that's very different than medical consent. So it's almost like stepwise. There's consent, there's medical consent, and then there's informed consent for research studies, right?
But what do you mean by, okay,
So it's almost like you need to keep in mind what the goal, what the purpose is, right? So in general consent, we're thinking day-to-day activities, right? In medical consent, they're actually showing up for their benefits,
for the patient's benefit?
for the patient's benefit. That's what a patient shows up for. For informed consent for a study, we don't know if they're going to benefit or not.
Which is basically most of the, the medical device companies will have
Exactly.
informed consent.
Yes.
Okay.
Right? And so we don't know if they're going to benefit or not. So there's a set of regulations that we should be aware of, especially when we're pulling all these documents together. We went through them pretty extensively during the first session. I just want you guys to be made aware of where the consent sections exist. There's, of course, the common rule, FDA regs, Declaration of Helsinki, ICH, GCP, and there's many more. You're also required to adhere to the institution where you're doing research, what their requirements are around consent. So what is informed consent? It's a clear and standard process. It's not a document, it's not a signature, it's a process. And it's a process where you're going to explain all that it takes to participate in a study, right? What device are we using? What risks are they going to be dealing with? And all the potential benefits that you're aware of. And we have the written form in order to be able to document that the person consented. So there's also like a written form available, right? The informed consent forms that we can document via signature that the person had everything explained to them, both in a written and an oral format, and that they comprehend it and that they signed up willingly of their own choice for the study. And the informed consent form and all the study documents that are patient facing actually, and the protocol will go in for IRB approval. Okay, and this is one part of making clinical research ethical, right? Is giving the person who's signing up for the study, this human subject, full awareness of what they're signing up for, right?
Is there a timeline of when you, like, how many, like if you're doing a procedure, can you give them the informed consent in the morning? And you can, right?
You can. But if they say, hey, you know what? I'm scheduled to come in for this procedure and there might be a clinical study. Can I have the consent form ahead of time? Yes. And after they sign the consent form, let's say they're going to be signing up, doing the first part of the study, going home and coming back for a follow-up. You also, when they leave, you give them a copy of their consent form so that they can go home, digest the information more. They have more time to discuss with other people if needed. Sorry guys, I'm dealing with two computers. Okay, so I want to kind of put this back in the perspective of like, where does this fit into the clinical trial as a whole, right? So trials are used to answer questions. That's basically why we write protocols and run clinical trials, right? And the questions are related to either new devices, therapeutics, drugs, or a technique that you're using. Protocols are developed to give an overview of what you're going to be doing during the study in order to be able to answer that question. And protocols can be pretty technical, right? You have a device section, right? A device section that can be pretty technical. You have a statistics section on how you're going to analyze your data. That's pretty technical. The overall protocol is not designed for the everyday reader, correct?
Yeah, someone who understands where you're writing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the protocol is really trying to give a full scope of what you're trying to assess, right? Are you checking for safety, effectiveness? Are you trying to collect preliminary data? Are you trying to figure out how frequently does this device need to be used in order to have a specific outcome? Those are all the types of questions that go into a protocol, right? A clinical trial as a whole is designed to study a new medical product, right? So you can have multiple protocols underneath one umbrella. And the purpose of it is to study it in people, right? For medical devices and humans is to study it in people. Now, the informed consent is basically about explaining the role of a subject participating in a trial to them. What role do they play in this study? So the information you're going to explain is going to allow them to make an informed decision on whether to participate or not. So put yourself in that person's shoes. What do you want to understand? I'm being given a black box and this is what's going to be used on me. I want to understand what risks are there. What are the potential benefits? How much time is it going to cost me? How much, if I miss work due to an injury, what's going to happen to me? And then they need to be made aware that this is a voluntary decision that is only theirs to make. And so that's where these regulations come into play. They really give you a framework and a structure of what to focus on. So we have 21 CFR Part 50. It's the FDA's regulation on protecting human subjects. It applies to all clinical investigations that are regulated by the FDA. Still, you still need to adhere to like local regulations if there are some, or institutional ones or rules, right? And then we have the Department of Health and Human Services has 45 CFR 46. So both of these would apply if if your clinical investigation is conducted or supported by HHS, right? And what I want you to focus on is the fact that if these two regulations state different things, right? Because you're dealing with 45 CFR Part 46 and 21 CFR Part 50, the regulations that offer the human subject the greater level of protection is the one that you follow. Yeah. I just took a snippet from the FDA's website to give you guys a section of like where to focus on. 45 CFR Part 46, you have the general rule, that's all the consenting, how to, you know, stuff in there. And then Part B, C, D, E are all the special populations. So if you're dealing with pregnant women, prisoners, children, they get special levels of protection. So that also needs to be considered, right? Now, 21 CFR Part 50 has a section on informed consent, right? And general requirements for informed consent. And it also has exemptions from the general requirements, okay? And there's a section that I think everyone should take a look at. It's 50.25. It's elements of informed consent. And that will give you like the major points you should hit in your informed consent form. Okay. So part of pulling any document together or making a presentation is to think about your audience, right? So in this case, who's your audience? It's the
subject.
Yep, the subject who'll be participating. So you need to be clear and complete. Don't assume that they have background knowledge that you have. Sometimes we get so entrenched in what we're doing, we forget that people outside of our setting have no background knowledge on it. So be clear and complete. This is not a sales pitch, right? You're not talking about my device is amazing. You're talking about this is what my device is intended to do. This is why I'm doing this test. These are the risks that you could, these are the potential risks of you participating. These are the potential benefits, right? And you're giving them an overview. What are the things you would care about? How much time is this going to cost me? Are you paying me for the time I'm there? How many blood samples are you going to collect? All of these pieces, right? So make sure that you, as part of pulling this together, you understand the comprehension level of your audience, right? So survey the population if you don't know them. If you're doing this at a doctor's office or a clinic, talk to the staff there. They'll know the level of comprehension of the population that's coming in there. If you're doing this study at UCI PhD School of Psychology, you're dealing with a different comprehension level, right? So you need to be aware of what the comprehension level is of the group of people that'll be reading this document and going through the consent process. Okay. So consent for research study has three major elements, right? Disclose all the pertinent information to the subject deciding to participate in the study. You need to keep in mind the competency level of the person either going through the study or the representative that's going to sign off for them, right? Their legal representative. And you need to be very sure that they're made aware that this is a voluntary study and it's only for them to decide. Okay. So this process involves giving potential subjects a full scope of the activities involved in the trial, right? Risks, benefits as a participant, and the right to decide if they agree to give consent. It can be written or oral, right? Most of the time it's written, but the oral piece is still very important. Oral is for subjects that have a issue with reading, right? So you have to make sure to write it out. It's a very set script so that you can read it to them, right? And there are two parts to consent. It's making sure that they're informed, and then there's the obtaining consent piece. So part of making sure that they're informed, they get the information. Information is also available to them in an ICF. It's also explained to the subject while they're given time to think through it and ask questions and inquire with other people. So if a subject comes in and says, hey, I've read this, I understand what you've told me, I want to take this home and talk to my spouse. I want to take it home and talk to my children, or I have an uncle that's a scientist, so maybe he'll be able to help me through understanding this. Then that's an okay. They take it home, they think about it, and they come back. The next piece is obtaining consent. And that's when a trained member of the staff, and you guys as the sponsor, need to make sure the person obtaining consent has a good enough understanding of your study, your product, that they can articulate to the subject what's happening that day or those days or those weeks or months, and answer any questions they have, right? That the trained member of the staff explains the parts of the study that they'll be participating in, right? And then the subject goes ahead and signs the document as part of getting consent, right? Okay. So central to consent and the informed consent process is the informed consent form, right? And that's basically the document responsible for containing almost all the details that a subject could need for deciding. And the reason I'm saying almost is there's always going to be questions. You'll have to answer them. If you notice the same exact question comes up,
You should modify
from 20 of 25 subjects, you should maybe put that answer within the consent form. Maybe that's a missing piece of information, right? The FDA does not dictate the type of language you have to have in the ICF, but they do have some basic elements that should be included, okay? I've put down where you can find a lot of this information, so that because it is a lot of moving parts to look through. Some of the yes.
I was just curious. There's no like a general template.
No, we were just talking about it, and I said if you want to come to the next session, bring your laptop. Maybe I could show her some of my templates that I've used, but it would depend on the topics that you're designing and like who the population is.
Yeah.
Can you share us with this presentation?
Yes. Yep. So required elements, right? A statement that the study is research. So you must state this study is research at some point in your consent form, right? An explanation of the purpose, the duration for the subject, and the duration for the study as a whole, right? A description of the procedures. If you need to create a flow chart, this is a good place for it. So that the subject can understand what's happening in sequence, right? That is relevant to them. And identification of any procedures that are experimental or not experimental, or for the purpose of the trial or not for the purpose of the trial. So let's say they're coming in and they're getting a blood draw collected, right? And that's part of their standard of care. Then you say at this point, when you get that first tube of blood collected, that first tube of blood is for standard of care. The second tube of blood where we're analyzing potassium, let's say, that is for the clinical study. So that they understand what's what, right? A description of potential risks, discomfort to the participant. So if you're having a needle stick, right? What are the potential risks? Like a bruise, a blood clot, a hematoma, it hurts, right? placing an adhesive sensor, you're going to say potential risks is that irritation from the skin adhesive, right? A description of any potential benefits to the participant and society as a whole. Don't forget that piece. A lot of studies say there is no benefit to you for participating, because financial compensation is considered a compensation for the time you're there, not compensation or a gift for participating in the study, right? So a lot of studies say there's no benefit to you, but there is the potential that this could benefit society as a whole or this patient population in the future, right? Disclosure of alternative procedures or treatments. This is for studies that are done where you're kind of analyzing what is the standard of care result versus the experimental, right? So you have to give them alternatives so that they understand that they don't have to do this as part of trying to pursue treatment for something, right? A statement of confidentiality about the records. So inquire with wherever you're doing the study, what are their standards? So like, how do they maintain PHI? And make sure that you share that with the subject, right? Within the consent form, your records will be maintained at the same standard as the institution maintains them. The sponsor will receive the data, but it'll be de-identified. I won't know your name, your address, your social security, all of those pieces. Compensation for injury if it occurs. So are you going to compensate? You don't have to compensate for injury, but you have to tell them you're not compensating for injury.
That's a little, well, that depending on the research you're doing,
Yeah.
right? For example, for someone who's just getting a discarded tissue, we don't have to go over where, like,
Then you say this is not relevant,
right,
right?
not
Yeah,
relevant.
exactly. Contact information for different types of questions. So you have to think about research related questions, research rights related questions, and medical injury related questions. So all of those pieces have to be accounted for. And a statement that this is a voluntary study, they get to decide whether to participate or not. And refusing to participate will not cost them anything in their benefits, right? Special considerations. Explaining if the research, treatment, or procedure may involve unexpected risks. So things that they may not think of, right? To the subject, to an unborn child. So do they need to be taking a pregnancy test at the beginning, right? Pregnant women, disabled people, people with specific diseases. Sometimes with drugs and devices, we say, hey, if you have this condition, this could be a risk that's added for you that's not added for other participants, right? So you have to make them aware of that. And then you as a sponsor and with the PI need to decide, do I want that member of the population involved in the study, or is it part of my exclusion criteria, right? Reasons why the research participation may be ended by the clinical trial investigator. And this can be things like subject is not compliant. They're not coming up for their follow-up visits, right?
Which is pretty common.
Which is common, and it doesn't help you any, right? So you need to put that in there so that they understand you're not compliant to our schedule of assessments.
We're not giving,
We're not having you keep coming. We're taking you out of the study. Or for other reasons, right? Their follow-up labs are not within the range that you need them to be, etc. Possible costs to the research subject. So loss of time from work, that's a cost, right? They could be at work. You're not going to pay them for the time that they should have been at work. What if it's someone that earns, $500 a day and they're coming in for a half day for your study? They have to make that decision. A statement about future findings and how those will be dealt with, like how you'll communicate those to subjects. We see that in the invasive device world and in the drug world quite often, right? They find out we used a drug during a clinical trial and 10 years later, we found out that there's an issue with the drug. You have to let the subjects that participated in the clinical trial know what you figured out about the drug later, right? And then plan number of subjects to enroll in the study or the trial. So elements of informed consent. We kind of did a brief overview, and now I'm going to kind of delve into each one specifically. So we had quite a bit of time at the front end. So how to start the informed consent form, right? It's like when you start anything, give an overview. Describe the study, include a statement that this is a clinical study that involves research. What are you investigating? Your product, your device, a method, or a drug? A picture is worth 1,000 words, right? It's so much easier to understand, like, hey, this is what's happening if you have a picture of the device or a picture of what's happening or a sequence of events and like a flow chart. Exactly. And it also gives them something to refer to when they take the consent form home, right? The take-home message of the consent should include the purpose of the study, their role, their specific role, and the length of study, and any procedures that are occurring that are part of the study. So I know a lot of us share subjects with whatever they're coming in for that day. So you want to make sure to split things up into, this is what you're coming in for as part of your medical care, and this is what we're doing that's part of the study.
But for the length of the study, that's the study that they're involved in, which means the duration from when we started with them till the end of that, not necessarily what.
I like to put both in. I like to give subjects.
But they don't
because
need to know more about our timeline, like, you know.
generally, even IRBs like to make sure that the subject is aware, like, hey, this study is going to last. It's not a one-day study, right?
Mhm.
You're not setting up shop and tearing down the next day and then I can't contact you anymore. So that causes some concern for subjects, right? But if you say this is a 3-month study,
Mhm.
but your enrollment will last the one visit you're here,
Oh.
or your enrollment will last from the time you sign the consent form until we do your exit interview a week later.
Mhm.
You know, so give them the details so they feel like they have a grasp of what investment they're making.
You're not gonna take their data and just
Yeah.
fly.
Yeah.
I see. That makes sense.
Risks and discomfort. So we're talking about physical risks, right? Needle sticks, blood clots, skin irritation, burns. And then if you have awareness of frequency they are going to be expected, let them know. Like say, hey, less than 5% of our preclinical data shows that there's some form of skin irritation, but it's mild, or you know what I mean, it's resolved within a day or two. Give them those details. That's helpful. Emotional, cost of participation, monetary, etc., loss of work, put that all in there because you don't want them to come back and ask you later. Yeah. Additional risks like loss of privacy, right? If data is being shared, lack of satisfaction with the results. So sometimes with aesthetic studies, part of the assessment is that a person gets to look at a set of images and their image is among those images. And they could have been very satisfied with their end results. But then when they look at their end results amongst 50 other results, they're not as satisfied, right? So you have to make them aware that they could become less satisfied with their end results as a consequence of being a participant in the
So you
study.
have to share the results with all the participants?
No,
Yeah.
no. They do it as part of an aesthetic review at the end of a study. So let's say you have breast reconstruction post mastectomy, right? You've had the subjects had a mastectomy, they have a reconstruction, they're comparing their end result to what was going on before with them. But let's say they're looking at the end result of 20 other women that have had the same exact procedure. And some of them look better than their results. Now, all of a sudden, it's like, I could have had a better result and my result is okay, but I don't think it's as good as it could have been. And they could become less satisfied. So you have to make them aware of that, right? Because it's a risk. Don't give false information. And it's acceptable to say, I'll get back to you. Check with your doctor. Let me go check with the sponsor. Those are all acceptable answers, right?
Well, for example, for cases like where the provider will be doing most of this, we have no contact with the patient. All we do is the consent. How can we make sure that the provider is?
You need to let them know. This is part of like your training,
They're
the
agreeing.
onboarding of the site. and making sure that site is trained to the standards that you want the study to run at, right? Is making sure that during that onboarding period, you articulate, hey, if there are questions related to this, please say you'll return to them. That you can put contact information for another party for them to ask other questions to, right? You can break it up and say, okay, if you have a medical issue, contact the study doctor or your doctor. If you have an issue with like the consent form or feeling like something was not done properly and it's an ethics issue, you contact the IRB. If you have a question about the device or et cetera, you can contact this person, you know, so break it up, make it specific, and it makes it easier on you because then the study staff at the site also has that information at their disposal, right?
Sure.
So what benefits, what potential a benefit would be? Make sure that they understand this cannot be guaranteed, right? So you can say, as part of participating in the study, your skin could heal faster. But it's not a guaranteed benefit. So if their skin doesn't heal faster, they don't come back and say, well, I didn't get the benefit you said I was gonna get, right? Compensation for participating. So that they understand they're going to get compensated for their time. And make sure that that's broken down per study related procedure, right? So that if you have a study that's lasting like 5 or 6 visits, and you have a subject that shows up for visit 1, visit 2, skips visit 3 and 4, and then shows up for visit 5, does not expect to get
The
full compensation. The compensation is for their time investment, right? Explain the impact the study may have on future patients and the general population. And this is really important because if you get your subjects buy-in from the beginning of the importance of what you're doing, you really increase the chances of compliance, right? You're way more likely if they see themselves as a piece of the puzzle to help an overall population, that's where you get great compliance, right?
I mean, the more they understand, the more they're gonna, right?
Exactly. Alternatives to participation. You just want to discuss what the other possibilities are, right? They don't have to enroll, and it could be as simple as that. If you're dealing with discarded tissue samples, you can say, hey, if you're not comfortable giving me your tissue, you don't have to enroll in the study. That's an option. That's the alternative, right? In that case. If you're doing something as part of treatment, then you give them the other options, whether it's standard of care or things that are not covered within their insurance, et cetera, so that they understand what their other options are, right? Explain that they can decline participation and that it doesn't cost them anything. It doesn't cause them to lose their rights, and they can do it at any point in the study.
Oh.
Yeah. So if a subject consents,
if they consent to go for 6 sessions, they can just stop at the 3rd and say, hey, we're good.
they can call you after they sign the consent form that evening and say, I changed my mind, I don't want to participate.
Oh. But how do you withdraw? Okay.
So then they're withdrawn from the study, right?
Just based on their verbal.
Yep. You have to make a note. Yep. Confidentiality. So this is important. Everybody worries about this, right? Who's going to have my information? Who's going to have access to it? I'm used to seeing my doctor. Now there's all these extra people in this environment that I'm not used to, right? So their personal health information, how it's protected, how they work like within that clinic, and then how the sponsor is going to receive that information, right? What level of scrutiny is going to be there between transferring that data? What pieces of that information are going to the sponsor? What pieces are not, right? You need to make them aware of who has access to their PHI, not only their regular clinic staff or the clinical site staff. Clinical data gets monitored, right? So monitoring staff will have access to it. The sponsor will have access to the data. There's potential for inspections. So that could be the FDA or the IRB. Explain that if there's going to be de-identification, explain that the data is going to be de-identified to ensure that their data, when shared, cannot be traced back to them. Okay, and then explain up front any potential publications. Even if you don't have them planned, but if you want to in the future potentially publish this data, you need to let them know, right? volunteering and withdrawal, right? So participant has the right to withdraw from the study at any point, even after having given consent. They're not tied to the study legally. The signature is not permanent. And the investigator, but they also have to understand that the investigator or the sponsor may withdraw the subject, right? Due to a lack of compliance, missed appointments, yes.
We also have the right to say,
Yeah,
"Hey,
you
after
could-
the third session, we don't need you anymore."
Yeah, you can call the investigator and say, hey, this person's out of range or whatever it is, you know?
Whatever the reason.
Yeah,
is.
or they have no showed for 2 sessions and I can no longer, this data is no longer worth anything to me, right? But put that information within the consent form so they understand.
That we can withdraw you from
That-
the
yeah.
study if it does not,
Yeah. Lack of compliance, missed appointments, not following directions, numbers are out of range, or due to becoming aware that there's a better treatment out there. Let's say there's 2 arms of a study and they find out that this test arm is not doing as well as the control arm. It's not ethical to keep having subjects participate in the test arm, right? If something is causing harm, right? Or if you find out that you have a AE or SAE that you didn't anticipate. When the device is on for too long, it causes bruising at the site. You didn't know it before the study.
And you see it on one of your subjects.
And you see it on like 80% of your subjects. So it's no longer some form you're submitting to the IRB for 1 or 2 off. You are now in a category of, we need to look and see what is happening here.
So you stop.
You
Yeah.
stop that.
Mhm. Yeah. Compensation and costs, right? Explain compensation and break it down by procedure. This is probably the most important piece of compensation because they'll always come back and say, hey, the study said it'll pay $1,000.
And where's my,
Yeah. And it's like you showed up to visit 1 and now you're showing up to visit 6, and what happened to all the visits in between, you know? This reduces confusion. Put it in a table, tie it to activities, tie each piece of the compensation to activities so that they can go home and look at it and it's there for you to reference, right? Don't overcompensate. This is considered coercion. The IRB will call you out on it, right? So having somebody make a decision to participate in the study that they're not comfortable participating in because the money is too high is not a good thing, right? Full disclosure, are you giving it as a gift? Are you giving the money as a gift card? Are you giving checks? Are you giving cash? Let's say you're having the subjects give a blood draw. You can say in there, you're getting compensated $50 for the blood draw, and you will be offered snacks after the study as part of, you know, helping you not feeling, you know, or feeling lightheaded post blood draw, etc. Right? Like they do with the Red Cross. So full disclosure, disclose potential costs. So I'm not compensating for travel time. Let's say, sorry, you came from 2 hours away and you took the train, but we're not compensating for travel time. That's yours to decide on, right? Tell them about taxes. If a subject earns more than $650, I think it used to be, I think it's still that actually, annually from clinical trials, you are to generate a 1099 and they are to pay taxes on the money that
If
they
you
earn.
generate how much?
More than $650 a year.
6 to,
$650 a year.
oh.
Yeah, they have to pay taxes on it.
Thanks on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the reason I'm saying to tell them about it up front is a lot of times what you get is really angry subjects that have spent the money and now are calling you saying, I owe taxes and I can't pay the taxes, right? Separate costs of what's being billed to insurance versus what the patient is paying for versus what the sponsor will pay for. Make a simple table so that they can understand the cost to them and refer to it. So if you're saying I'm using this medical device and there's this disposable piece of the medical device, but this is not your cost, this is going to be covered by the sponsor, that's information that's important to them, right? Explain costs for injury. You don't have to compensate for it, but do you compensate for it? Or do you compensate for medical care that's needed only, not time? Are you providing treatment? Is the clinic you're doing the study at also providing some form of treatment in case of injury? Explain cost for loss of time from work. Is this provided? Most studies do not provide it, right?
Because they're already compensated for you coming,
Mhm.
so you would figure
It's,
it out.
yeah, that's their decision, right?
Which make kind of sense. Unless
Um,
they need you for a full day, that's a different thing though.
There's lots of studies that do full days and it's still up to the subject to make that decision.
Maybe their compensation is pretty high.
Exactly. Contact information, make sure it's within the consent form because they do get a copy to take home so they can pull it up and figure out who to contact if there's an issue. Related to the study, it's typically the PI, the coordinator, or the study staff, right? Participants' right and injury, it's either injury is normally the doctor. Participant rights, it's typically the IRB unless the injury is at a certain level. Issues with the device, drug, or treatment, right? The sponsor, the principal investigator, and then eventually the sponsor if there needs to be explanation or more information given. Issues with the ICF or documents they filled out, like let's say they figure out after they leave, oh my goodness, that was inaccurate about my health history. I went home and I checked my medication and it's actually this dosage. The coordinator, the study staff, make sure all of that info is in there. Then it's like a one reference quick guide for them to figure out exactly where to go. Biospecimens. So everyone wants to know, what are you doing with my blood, my tissue, my etc. right? So what specimens are being collected? How are they being collected, right? And distinguish the ones that are collected for the study versus standard of care. So in your case, let's say it's tissue, right? It's discarded tissue. So it's standard of care is to remove that, right? But let's say you need a fresh tissue sample from somewhere else, then that is part of the study, okay? When are the specimens collections needed over the course of the study? This is for things like blood and urine and like, you know, things like that, right? Or a survey that they're taking. I need your urine at every other week visit. That's important to tell them. What if they show up and the only thing they're there for is to give urine and they went to the bathroom right before they walked in? Now you're stuck waiting for 2 hours. Or what if you need a fasting blood draw? This is all information that's important to them, right? What information are the specimens being analyzed for the study specifically? Right? So say, hey, yes, standard of care is that your doctor is getting hemoglobin, but for the study, I also need hematocrit, right? Even if it's the same exact blood draw, you have to tell them what is the extra information, right? Where will the specimen be stored and where will the results be kept? And how long will you store it for, right? Some studies, we want to be able to give the sponsor time to analyze the data. So that if one specimen is oddly out of range, we can say, well, was it the blood analyzer? Was it the person looking under the microscope at that point? Can we go back and reanalyze that sample? You can do that, right? So let them know the retention time of their specimen. And then this, when I first got into this, I didn't expect it, but then when I started working in clinical trials, I realized a lot of subjects want to know what the results are. So decide up front, like, are you going to share that? You need to let them know, hey, yes, you can ask for your results. No problem. Yes, you don't normally get your blood draw results, but because we're doing this in a study setting, here you go.
So for the discarded tissue through the standard of care, do we have to explain that in that, hey, once we get your tissue, we do our testing, we're gonna just like get rid of it? Do we have to explain to them that?
Yeah, you're gonna say, we're gonna do our testing. You will not have access to results. We will be discarding the sample post-analysis. Yeah. You're always safer stating it than not stating it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
You never know, somebody might come back and say, hey, I think this person's holding on to my tissue and I want to, you know, you need to just state it. It's easier. So the don'ts, right? It's like any written document, any process. Don't use language that ignores or diminishes their rights, their legal rights in the consent form. Be very careful about that. Don't use language that absolves the sponsor, the institution, or the investigator from liability for misconduct, right? If they do something wrong, you can't say, oh, as part of doing this study, whatever they do, they're protected, right? Don't be excessively lengthy in explanations. Be concise, because you're going to bore them and they're not going to read the full contents of what you want them to read. Don't be too focused on scientific or regulatory language. So this is a hard one because we're so used to talking about what we're doing in a very technical manner. You really have to dial it down and make sure that anyone can comprehend it, right? So if you have to use a scientific or regulatory word, control group, bias, this, that, you know, expand on it, explain it. Make sure that part of the consenting process is that the individual is actually discussing those words with the subject, right? Don't create an overly burdensome, lengthy consent form, especially for a very simple study, right? So if your study's simple, you don't need to have a 25-page consent forms. I can't even tell you how many ridiculously long consent forms I see. It makes no sense for it to be
Yeah, I
that long,
wouldn't
right?
read it if I would be like, nope, I'm
Yeah.
not participating. Yeah.
And don't consent in areas where there can't be discussion, right? Make sure you scope out where you're doing the study and that there's an area for you to consent, and that it's an area where you yourself would feel comfortable if you were doing something new and unique, having time with the person to ask questions and get responses, right? Because in a medical setting, we look around us, we try to figure out who's listening to me, who's not listening to me. Do I feel awkward in this setting? I mean, you need to make sure that the environment is allowing for this process to occur, right? Don't sell the study, just give the info, explain the study, answer the questions, and let them make the decision themselves. Don't scare the subject either, right? If it's a blood draw, you don't need to say, oh my goodness, you could bruise and you could this. It's a blood draw, just like you get a regular blood draw. Take your time to think about it and let me know if you have any questions, right? So potential research subjects should get a chance to read the consent, ask questions, right? Understand the study, take the consent home to discuss with others. An investigator should only get consent if some time was given to consider the study. So when you give them the consent form to read, let them read it on their own, right? Don't stand over their head waiting for them to finish. Has not been influenced or persuaded to participate in the study, right? Oh, come on, I really need one last subject. Not an appropriate thing to say, right? Information and the information in the consent was what needed to be in there for them to make a decision on participating, and it's easy to understand, and that there's some sort of an assessment of their comprehension. So typically during the consenting process, it's a conversation, right? So you can ask them, so any questions about X that's happening? And they'll give you some feedback, and we all know how to communicate, right? That tells you, hey, they read this and they understood what was written, right? So, oh, this is a very oversimplification of the process. You're going to disclose information. You're going to assess understanding. They understand that it's a voluntary choice. You're going to see what capacity they have to consent, and then the consent process is their authorization of it, right? So preparing for recruitment and reviewing the ICF. Read and reread the study documents, have other people read it, cross-check the takeaways. Make sure that if you have 5 different people read them, they're all getting the same message, right? Does it explain the ethical and scientific reasoning for doing the study? Does it explain your goal? What are you trying to achieve? Does it explain the subject's role to them, right? How are they part of the study? What part of the study are they? Is it coercive? Is it incomplete in any way? Are you just deciding not to disclose certain information that's relevant to them? Does it address all the key aspects of consent, like all the elements? Now, the next thing that I always recommend we do as sponsors is create a script. This will also go to the IRB, but this piece guarantees that the person that's performing the consenting process or as part of running the study understands the main points they need to hit when talking to the subject. And make sure, again, your script is written in plain English, right? So no medical jargon, legal jargon. Can have some clinical research words that you need, like control group, feasibility, etc., but translate them into simpler words or explain what they mean. Think about the setting. Who will be talking to the subject? Make sure the script is explained to them and get the buy-in from the research staff. So run the consent and run the script by the research staff. Make sure it makes sense to them. It might make sense to you, but it might not make sense to them. It may make sense to the PI, but maybe the PI is not the one getting consent. Maybe it's just the person at the front desk, right? Maybe that's the person interacting with the subject. You want to make sure that person understands your script. Think through the environment, right? Where is consenting need to happen? Make sure it's a conversation, right? Your script is written like you're talking to somebody, right? Keep in mind the main purpose of why the patient is in the clinic, right? Think about the situation, reduce the burden on the patient and the staff. Don't make your consent and your consenting process something that's going to take an hour if they're actually there for a procedure, right? They're trying to turn over patients. You don't want to get to the point where the staff is like, oh, I'm going to make it so the subject doesn't want to participate because I don't want to deal with, delaying my next procedure, right? So do yourself a favor, right? And the script should be conversational. Now, this is part of your IRB approval package for the study, right?
What do you mean that's part of your package? The copy of the consent or the approved consent?
So everything that's going to go to the IRB includes your protocol, your consent, your script. Let's say you have an advertisement that goes to the IRB. Anything patient facing or they fill out goes to the IRB as well. Like health history, if they fill it out. If it's a CRF and the doctor's filling it out or the study staff is filling it out and asking the questions, that does not need to go to the IRB. Okay. So you have a questionnaire at the end that goes to the IRB, right? So it's the ICF is really part of the study documents that are there to support the overall study, right? So you have your informed consent, you're building it based off your study protocol, you have clinical study reports, consenting scripts, you have other scripts like a phone script if somebody's doing screening via phone, your case report form, and your investigator's brochure. The takeaways. Informed consent is founded on research ethics, right? Based off research ethics. Informed consent is about giving the potential subject all the information they need to make an educated decision about participation. You need to keep your audience in mind when pulling all these documents together. Consent is a process that includes a give and take. So it's an exchange between parties, right? And there are regulations that define what's required and what's expected.